Hey, this is the fifth part in StarCraft 2 history. This one spans the timeline of just two tournaments, MLG Columbus and GSL Super Tournament, both in 2011, both within the first half of the year, in I think from May to June. And the reason I wanted to just focus this one on just two tournaments is because you see the rise of two very critical players within these two tournaments. In one of the previous videos, I talked about the next wave, with MMA rising up through the GSTL and making a huge name for himself as the ace of Slayers, as the son of Voxer, so to speak. And MLG Columbus is the first tournament he wins, and it is an incredible tournament. One of the tournaments that really puts StarCraft 2 on the map as an entertainment sort of game where you could just watch the game and it's super entertaining. And part of the reason is because of MMA's style, where MMA was this incredibly intelligent player, but he was also a player that had a very high intuition for multitasking aggression, which is different from Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void. And what I mean by that is, in Wings of Liberty, there was a certain sacrifice you had to make if you wanted to do this harassment type style, because with Medivacs, there was no boost. So if your Medivac was seen or it was cut out, there's no escape. That's an instant death. And so many Terrans believed, and arguably, maybe correctly, that multitasking was in fact a terrible move to make. And the reason is because you're not getting that much out of it if they catch it. And the problem with the multitasking drop style of the Terran is that you're sacrificing a lot more time and a lot more resources relative to Heart of the Swarm or Legacy of the Void, because with Medevac boost in both of those, a Medevac can't come back in time to help defend or come back to help flank. In Wings of Liberty, if you send that thing out, or if you send more than just one Medevac out, like in MMA's case, you might send 3 or 4 out. That's about 40 supply out there. And so if the Zerg attacks in this instance, you will have a very hard time holding, and that could just be the end of the game. So that is actually why, personally, I believe Medevacs were strategically much more dynamic in Wings of Liberty, because it had a much higher sacrifice cost to them. And so you had to really focus and build a style around it. You had to really understand how you were pulling the enemy around and what you were getting out of that beyond just damage, potential economic damage. Because the way MMA used it, he actually thought of it as a way of controlling the enemy, of figuring out of trying to keep the tempo up while building up at home, trying to keep the information within his grasp, and he would be able to, in a way, lower like the potential death cost of, like, if Zerg just counterattacks out of rage or something, by setting up correctly. And this takes a lot of understanding, a lot of work, and he and Gumiho are the only two players to have used this style of Wings of Liberty. And in my personal opinion, except for the case of Maru, they were probably the best multitasking players using Medivacs in Wings of Liberty history, when we're talking about the strategic aspect of the usage of that the usage of that strategy. Because unlike every other player after, except for, like I said, Maru's a very specific and interesting case. Basically, none of the other players ever had to go through the strategic problems and create a style that could actually overcome those problems. And so, because of MMA's style, he was an incredibly fun player to watch, arguably the funnest to watch at that time, at that moment. And he was, we already saw parts of that in the GSTL with incredible ace matches against MVP, another incredible ace match against Dongrigu, and MLG Columbus was his like crowning event, where he was going to become, where people legitimately thought he was going to overtake MVP as the best Terran in the world. And this is a part you won't really hear in StarCraft 2 if when people recollect it, but a lot of the community sentiment in both Korea and outside Korea was people wanted MMA to win, just like they wanted Marine King to win. And the reason they wanted both of these players to win is because they had these incredibly exciting styles. MMA was the son of boxer, like who wouldn't love that storyline? Marine King was this emotional player who could really get you invested into his style of play and his games. Whereas MVP, nobody knew anything about him. Like he actually sounds like Money Hunter. Like the only interview we've ever heard from MVP before that time was he switched from Brood War to StarCraft 2 because he thought he could make more money in StarCraft 2. What you don't hear is like he did it because he believed he had to do something to support his family. He wanted to give his family money in order to just, stuff like this. And his play style was very similar to Innovation and Tasia, which is Innovation is obviously a player who like could take standard builds, modernize them, and then put them to the cutting edge. And MVP was very similar to that, where he took like Marine King's like ideas of micro. He took Jinro's ideas of 3-base. He took some ideas from Brood War. He could even take ideas from this multitasking style of MMA, and he could like kind of combine it all into a cohesive, better whole. And at the same time, he played more like Tasia in the sense that he was much more defensive, much more. He played a much more passive. It's hard to say whether it's passive or aggressive. It's in between where it's like the correct move every single time, and so it seemed kind of rote. It seemed very boring, and it seemed inevitable that he was going to win, and that's why he was given the nickname Sleepy Chung. So that's why MLG Columbus is a big tournament for MMA. It's a big tournament for StarCraft 2 because MMA style is just so addicting. It's so fun to watch, and I think his 2011 style is it is what defines MMA for me, even though he doesn't really play this style after you get into Heart of the Swarm anymore because of the of the expansion changes. And throughout this tournament, he beats a number of pretty good players. Let me check exactly. I know he beats Lucira twice, and those were really great games, even though the final score ends up being 4-1 in MMA's favor. He also beats Idra, and I think that's the famous Idra game where like MMA blew up his own command center by accident, and then Idra just GG'd out. So another classic Idra moment, right? And there was a few other interesting games that happened here. Like Moon actually had a pretty good run. Naniwa and MC definitely is something really funny because basically I'll get into this eventually when we talk about Rain because you have to understand the PvP meta in order to understand how important Rain was. But for this particular match, basically, Naniwa was about to kill MC in like the second game with a 4-gate. And 4-gate was obviously the build for PvP back then. And instead of finishing off MC, because MC had gone for a Dark Shrine, but it was at the back of his mirror line, and Naniwa didn't see this. Instead of finishing off MC or pushing a little bit further to see the Dark Shrine, he dances his units, and in celebration of what he thinks is his impending victory, and this is enough time for MC to get the Dark Shrine up and then to build Dark Templar and then win the game. So I always thought that was like a funny match, even though Naniwa probably doesn't think of it that way. MC ends up winning that one, but loses to Lucira, and like I said, Lucira is another example of a player who was stuck in Code A, even though he was a very good player and arguably one of the best Zergs at that time, which kind of shows like the depth of the overall field that we were talking about, especially Korea, but even applies to some of the foreigner scene too. So you can't really talk about MLG Columbus without talking about the GSL Super Tournament. And the GSL Super Tournament, in retrospect, is a funny fucking tournament in the sense that it is what we call the height of the GOM TVT era, where obviously Terran was the strongest race, but it wasn't because of any kind of balance issues. Like if you sent like Protoss players or Zerg players with better knowledge of how to play that game, I think it'd have been completely balanced. Except for maybe Zerg players are definitely a bit fucked a bit because the Infestor wasn't that good, but they definitely have chances to play it out. And They definitely probably need the 5 range queen eventually, but definitely like Terran is favored there. And then Protoss wasn't as favored. And I think Protoss might have been favored at points, but until they took out like a High Templar, and then they took out the Void Ray. There's like a Void Ray thing charge where it was like super strong too. But the real reason Protoss couldn't win was because they didn't really understand. They didn't really have the fundamental understanding that was as strong as it would turn out to be later. And there's a legitimate reason for this because Protoss as a race works the most differently compared to its StarCraft 1 equivalent. And if you've ever looked at Brood War and StarCraft 2, you would notice that none of the races really work or translate perfectly, or in fact are very different in very critical areas. And I'll get back into that later when we talk about Kespa, but this is kind of what happens to. This is kind of why. This is kind of why the GSL Super Tournament is funny in retrospect, because it wasn't like Terrans were like overpowered or anything. It just happened that, it just happened that the meta, the most effective tactical, like advantage available was all in Terran's favor at the time, and that's partially because of players like MMA, players like Marine King, players like MVP, who had like pushed forward the Terran meta further than the other races. And the reason I think this is such a funny tournament is because of the finals. Because obviously at this finals, MMA was the favored one because he had just won MLG Columbus. He had beaten a shitload of good Terrans, and then Polt had looked shaky in the semifinals. I think almost losing to Top, I believe. Or it might have been the quarterfinals. No, it was in the semifinals. Like he barely beats Top 3-2 in a TVT, and like I said this before. Top was basically a macro player, but he didn't necessarily have the best control. Whereas like MMA had both of those things. So if you were looking at the way Polt played against Top, it was much more about his control than it was about the macro play. Whereas MMA, you looked at him, he could do both. And so many people were picking MMA to win this entire thing. And Polt actually makes the entire tournament like defunct in a way. And what I mean, and that's what makes it so funny in retrospect, is what I mean by that is he basically in the finals does he basically pulls out a tactic that completely changes all of Terran versus Terran for the rest of the time. And this tactic I'm talking about is the equivalent of what Marine King did versus Kyrix. And what Marine King did versus Kyrix, if you recall, was he was the first guy to think of the idea of splitting Marines, and he was the first guy to do it extremely effectively against Banelings and Zerglings. And Polt did the exact same thing, but against siege tanks. And the reason this is so critically important is because everybody up to that point had been putting the siege tanks in the wrong place. If, tactically speaking, Polt's ideas had existed before then, because they were all way too aggressive. They were all, none of them had enough support. There was not enough information for the tank positions for where you were putting them. And Polt uses this style, and he basically beats up MMA. Like MMA there was no way MMA was going to win this one because of the tactical like evolution Polt does here, and it's also the first glimpse second glimpse, I guess, the first glimpse you see of him in the GSL Open with the 1-1-1 build, and as like a tactical like genius in a sense. And this is the second time you see it, and this is actually one of the most underrated matches in StarCraft 2 history, because everybody remembers the Marine King versus Kyrix one. Nobody remembers this one. And the reason nobody remembers this one is because everybody was rooting for MMA to win that title, MMA to fulfill the storyline of becoming the best Terran over MVP, so to speak. And nobody really believed in Polt. And obviously Polt had that thing about him as being like a potential villain, because he had shit talk Jinro, even though he was right. And so the tactical realities that Polt bring into the game were kind of ignored. And everybody was just like pissed off, like, oh fuck, Polt won. And Polt wins his first and only GSL, but this is the rise of MMA and Polt. And now we come to the title of this video, which is the Terran Triumvirate, because MVP MMA and Polt are all incredibly important Terran players, and their rivalry. They have a rivalry with each other that a rock paper scissors almost like rivalry where like MMA could be MVP or first favorite against MVP. MVP always beat Polt, but Polt always beat MMA, and this is how the rivalry ended up playing out. Every time most of the times they played each other in like the GSL, the team leagues, sometimes even online matches, and it was always an interesting idea of styles, because obviously you have like MVPs is very solid player who could do everything, but MMA had this aggressive style about him that could kind of break down MVP towards the later parts of the game, and Polt could beat down MMA because Polt was way more aggressive back then, way more One Punch Man-esque kind of style, where he would do like 1 or 2 base all-ins, but they would be so tactically well executed that MMA couldn't do anything, whereas he ran that into MVP. MVP was way too solid for that shit and beat it down pretty handedly. So you have the 3 Terran, that's why I call them the Terran Triumvirate, and all 3 of them go on to become incredibly important figures in StarCraft 2 history, and all of them have pretty long-lived careers, especially Polt and MMA. MMA is still playing to this very day, as far even after coming out of his military retirement. And it's always interesting when we talk about StarCraft 2 history early on, just because a lot of people kind of like ignore or whitewash it, like, oh, everybody was easy back then. It was really that impressive that MVP won so many GSLs. No, it was pretty fucking impressive, because these guys we're talking about, Polt and MMA, this years after their peak form, they were still beating some of the best players in the world. So yeah, I think it was pretty impressive. I'm not really sure why people denigrate the top of the pack so much from back then, because I think that is actually the most arguable as to whether or not that has increased or decreased, and it depends very much on the player, very much on the expansion, very much on the meta and the patch, and all of these multivariable reasons you look into it. Anyway, with MLG Columbus MMA 1, with GSL Super Tournament Polt 1, that is the creation of the Terran Triumvirate, and the 3 of them turn out to this rivalry doesn't play out very long because of the inevitability of the patch coming eventually. But it's an important talking point when you're talking about all 3 of them, because in a way their styles are intercorrelated against each other, and all 3 of them go on to be 3 of the most successful players we have ever seen in StarCraft 2 history. And when we look at like this is an aside, but when we look at the Kespa Terrans and the ESF Terrans, which is basically a weird sort of schism, just because ESF didn't actually include all the Terrans pre-Kespa, but let's just say the pre-Kespa Terrans and then the post-Kespa Terrans. The only truly great post-Kespa Terran in my eyes was Innovation, but almost all of the pre-Kespa Terrans were like a lot of them went on to be like all-time greats relative to the Kespa Terrans, and I'm not really sure why. I actually think this triumvirate I'm talking about right here, Polt, MMA, MVP, the way they played, the way they forced people to play, made them think about the game in a way that the when Kespa arrives, like, and like all 3 of them basically go out. And so the way they played the game, the way they're understanding the game, no longer really exists in Korea, because Polt goes to NA, MMA goes to EU, and then MVP dies, or MVP's like career ends because of injuries. And so the other guys that are standing around, like Tasia also basically leaves Korea. So their Terran's understanding as a race kind of goes down, and that understanding from like those 3 players and like Tasia doesn't really get translated into the rest of the Terrans that play after them. Like even like Maru, who had been playing with them, like his style isn't very like, it's not emulatable. Like, you can't imitate it. But that's like an aside for another piece of time. But this is the end of the Terran Triumvirate, and I'll see you guys next time.